Alright guys, so if you think this year isn't spicy enough, fireworks are coming in a matter of days. I sound like the harbinger of doom, but the horsemen of the financial apocalypse, they're all lining up. And we have to talk about the biggest one, which is Janet Yellen's replacement. Now, almost every Treasury Secretary is delusional to some degree. Now, Yellen still believes she has left the US economy in a very good place. The lockdown stimulus was good, and despite inflation, creating a ton of government jobs was the right move, at least according to her. Now, as crazy as that sounds, her replacement is going to ramp up the madness. Scott Bessent is a US hawk, and we must talk about his policies here. He is in the new driver's seat and he wants to push for even more decoupling. And it's not just industrial policy against China, but to maintain the primacy of the US dollar. Now, this is a clear sign that Washington knows their financial power is slipping. Now, Bessent has confirmed he wants the dollar to stay as the reserve currency, because if it doesn't, the US economy would collapse like a house of cards. But this part is critical. He is an advocate of using economic sanctions as a strategy. Now, I don't know about you, but it sure sounds like weaponizing the currency isn't over just yet. Now, this sounds quite contradictory. If the US reshores production and tariffs the world, won't trade with the US drop? And should the trade deficit fall, by definition, it would mean fewer dollars flowing into the global economy, and that would cause scarcity. Hedge funds today are betting on a stronger dollar in 2025. They know Trump's policies are going to drive dollar strength much higher. Leverage bets on the dollar have hit the highest point since 2019. It's even more aggressive than 2022 when the Federal Reserve started hiking rates. Wall Street is betting that global demand for dollars will accelerate this year. What Besant wants is to ensure this demand remains solid, because if the world continues to shun the dollar, a lot of bad things will happen for Trump's economic plan. Even if global economies trade less with the US, Besant wants all other transactions in the world to be done in the USD. So Saudi Arabia trading with India, Besant wants them to use the US dollar. Now why? Because it would sustain demand for US Treasury debt. It's existential for the US to ensure global funds keep flowing into the bond market. Yields have to stay as low as possible or the national debt would be at enormous risk. Foreigners today hold the largest share of US debt at around 33%. But this percentage is under threat. The BRICS countries, they are buying more gold. Even G7 allies like Japan, they are selling off their holdings. A stronger dollar will cause more currency crisis, and that in turn could force governments around the world to dump even more debt. Now, from the perspective of the US, this isn't good news at all. Trump's plan is going to cause a lot of hardship to US consumers, especially when it comes to the tariffs. Mortgage rates are really rebounding, a credit card crisis is still raging on, and the LA fires just made the situation worse. The amount of damage caused is actually very shocking. $275 billion in economic damage will be incurred. And where is that money going to come from, guys? Either the government will have to pay for it, which means borrowing money, or people in LA, they have to foot the bill and spend down their own savings. And either way, the US can't afford more economic disasters. But that's exactly what might happen with the coming trade war. Now, when you decide to tariff the world, including allies and adversaries, you have to prepare for retaliation, and the most direct consequence would be higher inflation. And there's really no dodging this outcome. Across the spectrum, from both the left and the right, household spending is going to rise substantially. A 20% global tax and 60% on China will spark a cost of living crisis. On the high end, US families will spend an additional $6,000 a year. It's alarming when you realize inflation today is already a big problem. The last thing Besant wants is for bond yields to go up even higher. That will blow up the budget of US households. You have to issue trillions of dollars in debt to keep the system running, and foreigners, they better be around to soak up this additional supply. During Yellen's term, we saw an incredible increase in the money supply. The US economy was running hot at 6.4% of GDP. That was the deficit. She borrowed a ton of money to fund the Inflation Reduction Act, and of course, let's not forget to give Ukraine. But Biden wants to do the reverse. To me, at least, that's going to be mission impossible. Asking the US government to spend less is like asking a fish to climb a tree. His plan is a big reach. To even hope to accomplish it, he needs a stable bond market. By 2028, Besson wants to reduce the federal deficit to just 3% of US GDP. In other words, he wants to borrow less money from the world. To make this happen, two very painful things will have to occur. Now, firstly, the global tariff war will have to work. The US has to win this confrontation. And let's assume that they do and the world rolls over. There's still the problem of big budget cuts. We'll see a ton of cuts to Medicaid and social benefits to the middle and low income Americans. They're going to get cut as well. Now, how popular is that going to be? Living standards will collapse. And that's why the dollar dominance has to be maintained here. If this breaks, all of Trump's plan could crash and burn in a hurry. And this means in 2025, we can expect an economic struggle to defend the dollar. Trump could tariff countries that decide not to trade in the US dollar. Now, maybe he'll just force G7 allies to buy up more treasury bonds to keep the yields low, right? You never know what's going to happen. Because we know countries like China, they're dumping theirs. Which brings us to the next thing Besson said. Now, this is important because it's a hint of US-China relations going forward. According to him, China is officially in recession. In fact, he believes that Beijing is on the verge of a collapse, and that's despite the economy growing by 5% last year.
China is the most imbalanced, unbalanced economy in the history of the world. They are in a severe recession/depression. They may have minus 4% disinflation, and they are attempting to export their way out of that as opposed to doing the much needed internal rebalance.
That's very weird because in the next breath, he admits that China still has a lot of money to build infrastructure. If an economy collapsed, they wouldn't have money for anything, would they?
China will build 100 new coal plants this year. There is not a clean energy race. There is an energy race. China will build 10 nuclear plants this year. That is not solar. I am in favor of more nuclear plants.
So there's an incredible disconnect here. China is both strong and weak at the same time. I mean, you have to choose one direction, right? Is China a big economic rival that you have to guard against? Or are they crashing and no longer a threat? Because you can't have both. There's a lot of confusion going on, which means the US might continue to underestimate the Chinese, which I feel is very dangerous here. They could try to clobber China, but most likely the policies will backfire. But let's look at the data here because it cuts through all the BS. China's GDP grew by 5.4% in the latest quarter, and this brings overall GDP growth for the last year to 5% even. What's interesting is the biggest factor for the jump in Q4. 60% of the rebound is from China's policy to boost consumption. In other words, the stimulus is starting to work. And this means the Chinese now have a playbook to fight back against the US. Even if tariffs are imposed, China could ramp up the stimulus to boost domestic spending. One great example is the trade-in program, and it's a very simple solution. People trade in their old stuff and the government subsidizes the new purchase. So if you have an old rickety car, you can just swap it for a new Chinese EV and the Chinese government will subsidize part of the purchase. And this has reached over 1.3 trillion yuan in revenue. That's a boost in consumer spending of $180 billion. Now what Besson is doing is actually building up China's domestic market, which is going to further grow their economic influence, and is really quite elementary. If Chinese consumers buy more, and US consumers they buy less from the world, who has more power to influence the global economy? And if you really want to compare strength, a better comparison is the cost of living.
Hey, US government, you have some explaining to do. So I downloaded the little red book and I made a new bestie. We were just talking about the differences and similarities between China and the US, and she ended up going to the market and sent me a picture of her local market. I picked what was familiar to me and what I knew, and that was corn on the cob. I seen that 1 kilogram, which I found out was 2.2 pounds, was 6.90 yen. So I went on Google because it's free, right? And I looked up to see what would that be in US dollars. 94 cents. 94 cents. What would it be here in America, you might ask? When you do the math, $7. Is this what they don't want us to know?
While it's true that US salaries are 3 to 4 times higher, the cost of food is much lower in China. Taxes are also lower, so the standard of living is higher there. And this is before the coming trade war. It's going to be very ugly in the months to come. And if you think this is bad, there's actually one place where the situation is even worse. Yes, somewhere else in the world is not doing well. They are actually doing horribly, and that's the EU. Now, by now, we know the EU story, the European story. Energy prices, they're decimating the economies. Inflation has rebounded back up to 2.4%. This is in comparison to an already high baseline. So if you want the EU to recover, we need to see a zero or negative CPI print. But is that going to happen? Because the EU just dug themselves a deeper grave from 6 feet under to an inflation hell. In their latest sanctions package, Brussels wants to ban the import of Russian LNG. In addition, they want to expand the sanctions on Russia's shadow fleet. So now less oil and gas can flow to the west. They are scoring own goals like never before. This wouldn't be a problem if they have cheap alternatives, but there's no additional nuclear power. All their energy imports come from places they are squeezing them. It's a one-way street for EU companies. There's virtually no way for their industrial sector to recover. And here's why. The EU has already lost Russian supply from the Ukraine transit. 5% of cheap pipeline gas is gone. And if they go ahead with this and they remove Russian LNG, they will lose another 7% of total gas imports. Russian LNG is more expensive than pipeline gas, but because Russia is just next door, it's definitely cheaper than US LNG. It's probably even cheaper than buying from the Middle East. And once again, we are seeing Europe impose a punishment that's going to backfire. They aren't really sanctioning Russia, they're sanctioning themselves. So we're truly living in a twilight zone here. If the EU wants to ban Russian gas, you at least need a viable exit plan. Because if you don't, you can't compete with the US and Chinese industries. What's crazy is who is endorsing the LNG ban. It's the Baltic countries. But who's really gonna get hurt here? It's gonna be France, it's gonna be Spain. They import the most Russian LNG, over 5 million tons each last year. France and Spain, they have big industrial sectors that need cheap energy. And if the ban goes through, it's game over for many companies there. Production could leave and head to the US or China. So the ban is truly a bizarre move here. It doesn't help Europe, it only helps the US and China. And these are your industrial competitors. At this point, I have no idea what the EU is doing anymore. But what I do know is how crazy 2025 is going to be. We have to prepare for a world of structurally higher inflation. Decisions from all sides, they're just pointing that way. Also, don't expect dollar sanctions to go away as well. The US might actually force the world to save their bond markets, and this time, China isn't going to help. But as always, let me know what you think. Will the US sanction the war? And what is Europe even thinking today? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.